Claudia is a most lamentable character. Yes, she is ferocious. Yes, she is quite intimidating, as Season 5, in its final few episodes, demonstrates quite overtly. And if I were a kid watching this show for the first time, I might be tempted to scorn and despise her, like many people did when they saw Azula in Avatar: The Last Airbender as kids. But, as is the case with Azula, I mostly feel sorry for her watching the show as an adult. She is increasingly lonely and desperate. Desperately searching for this wholeness, this sense of harmony and cohesion that she does not have anymore, that has been deprived of her by circumstances, some of which are within her control and some of which are not. She is more lonely than any other character in the show now. She wants Viren to come back so badly. Number one, because he's her father, and she loves him, and her love is unebbing, never fading, and because the search to revive him gives her a sense of direction and purpose that she would otherwise have lacked. But also, she seeks to revive him because otherwise she's alone. She only has Erebos. She's lost everyone else, even her brother. She is surrounded by the darkness, and so the darkness deepens. She burrows deeper into it because she does not feel like she has any other legitimate and satisfying options. These are her choices, and I do not wish to excuse them. Her decisions, as she would passionately say, are hers alone. Yet they are decisions that she has made because of an increasing despair that has crept into her spirit. She reminds me a little of the version of Satan that John Milton creates in Paradise Lost as this aggrieved rebel against the cosmic order that he believes is unjust. He's charismatic, passionate, fiercely determined, and yet despondent by his acknowledgement that he is ultimately alone. He is forced into a position of not just provisional, but inevitable and existential rebellion, i.e. not just rebellion against a specific order or a specific way of things, a rebellion that has the hope of creating a kind of change, but rather a doomed fatalistic rebellion that goes against the basic moral order of the world and thus can only end in complete failure. It is driven by ego and passion more than anything else, and because of that, it is rather admirable and rather pitiable. In any case, Claudia will fail. I'm reminded also of Dostoevsky, especially Demons, which, unpopular opinion perhaps, but to me that's my favorite book by him. I think it's his best. And it's fundamentally a book about the relationship between a rotting society and the malaise of individuals. It is about a father's generation that pursues their own idealistic caprices and abandons the construction of a basic sense of continuity with their heritage, with their past, with a sense of social connectivity in an age of upheaval. Instead, the father's generation pursues what it thinks of as being so modern and so intelligent and rational, and it ultimately leads to a generation of the sons, the younger generation, that has no moral fabric to draw upon, that has no sense of coherence or continuity, no guidance to temper their behavior, and so they become desperately nihilistic and destroy that society, much to the rather pathetic shock of the father's generation. The older generation is not as pitiable in The Dragon Prince. Viren, of course, fails his daughter, a fact that he is desperately aware of and he is trying to correct. But Viren, for all his faults, was motivated by genuine idealism. He rebelled against what he thought were cruel and vile injustices and inequalities. He believed human beings had been dealt a cold and heartless hand by a world order that favored elves and dragons, and he fought against that order to the point of fanaticism and zealotry. He kept fighting, and he kept losing, and ultimately he found that his efforts were futile, that his perspective was ultimately limited, and that his rebellion against the accepted order could not succeed, as it was based on a narrow perspective that could be tinged by selfishness and myopic small-mindedness. It's not necessarily that Viren's goal was entirely unjust, but that to pursue a goal like that requires someone with a pristine, crystalline heart, above temptation, above the deep flaws that Viren now knows he has. Viren couldn't be that person, and said he doomed Claudia. But the older generation as a whole, Rayla's parents, Runan, even King Harrow, as noble and heartfelt as he is, made a lot of terrible mistakes. The father's generation has not necessarily created an environment conducive to the flourishing of the children's generation. The world is fundamentally fragmented and fractured. There's no continuity, no cohesion, no basic sense of community. As such, disorientation sets in. People are not sure who they are and what they want. They live in a society that's constantly amorphous and unsettled. Claudia, driven into the margins of that fractured society by her loyalty to her increasingly misguided father, eventually is in a dire position. She does not have a lot of options. and her options diminish with every passing season. Even if she becomes increasingly skeptical of Erebos, it's not likely that she would want to show that skepticism, because Erebos is, she believes at this point, all she has. The connection she felt to a greater whole, this greater social fabric, has completely decayed. She is a lonely, deracinated individual, and she does not have a lot of options. She does not have a lot of reasonable, tangible choices available to her. And it is partly because of this that I find her cause to be much more lamentable than Viren's. I'm not saying she's a better character, or even that she's a more sympathetic character than Viren. I wouldn't say that's true. But what is true is that she is a significantly more lost character than Viren ever was. Viren, if nothing else, was committed to causes that he deeply believed in. And it is not the fact that Viren's choices lead to his own death that Viren laments so much. Yes, there are choices that he made as a result of terrible and disorienting circumstances in which he found himself. He lost Sarai, whom we see he greatly respected. Later on, he lost his best friend in the world, King Harrow, the person who served as a noble reminder of what higher ideals could accomplish. With Harrow gone, Viren became increasingly desperate. But even so, his choices were his. He accepts them. He views them with great melancholy, since he believes they have been ultimately futile and only served to surrender his spirit to a malevolent quasi-deity. He was too narrow-minded, he was too insular to see the danger he was in. But he accepts that tragedy. What is worse for Viren is what he inflicted on his daughter. His mania has caught in her and deepened in her. Claudia does not have the same level of deep ideological commitments as Viren. She likely shares his worldview, but she does not ever seem as confident about it, even when she's talking to Soren about the goodness of Erebos and dark magic, and even when she's making decent points, such as how dark magic is the reason Soren is alive, she does not have that deep fervor that Viren has. Her passion largely comes from, number one, her loyalty to her father, which is unabating, and number two, her desperation for answers, for a basic sense of coherence that has been lost. If it cannot be found in the past, if it cannot be found in those who have abandoned her, then at least it might be able to be found in this dark, arcane force from a distant world. And thinking about Claudia's lamentable situation, I wonder if Soren made the right decision to stay with the Dragon Prince group, with Callum and the rest, and leave behind his sister. Yes, in Season 3 it is presented as this heroic triumph. It's presented as Soren finally freeing himself from the negative influences surrounding him, and it is all that, don't get me wrong, but it's also For Claudia, the severing of her last link to the kindliness, the guileless virtue that Soren represents. Deracinated from that, Claudia can only float on her own thoughts and her own impulses. Thoughts and impulses that gradually lead her to darker and much more foreboding places, psychologically and philosophically. She wants to rebel. She feels this deep rancor in her heart for those around her, those she once thought were close to her. People like Soren, people like Callum, who in a different world might have been her husband. They might have grown up and gotten married and had kids in a stable and prosperous world. Instead, Claudia is desperately alone, hating others, arguably hating herself, and above all, feeling, as Dostoevsky constantly emphasized, the inadequacy of individual ambition, however fervid it might be, to create a new order, to create a new sense of stability and coherence, to replace the lost, historically derived order that has collapsed in a time of great turmoil and uncertainty. Callum's group represents a better alternative. It represents the capacity for people from different backgrounds to come together and form a hope for the future, a tenuous but nonetheless more promising world in the ruins of a crumbling old order. Their strength comes not from them as individuals, but from the bonds between them. Claudia is outside that network of bonds, and she suffers, and she's so terribly lonely, and only becoming lonelier. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Again, I don't mean to absolve Claudia from her faults, which are numerous, but no one is created in a vacuum. Ourselves are not stable, but they are constantly in the process of being created and recreated, formed and reformed based on our interactions with our environment. If our environment becomes rather bleak and hopeless, it takes a very strong person to not lapse into despair and thus make a lot of bad choices. Claudia does not have that kind of strength, but not a lot of people do. So anyway, tune in soon for the next analysis. It will be coming soon, that I promise you. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.